The night Julia broke a cursed king's chains, she had gone to the prison to steal medicine, not to free anyone, not to change the fate of the kingdom, not to do anything remotely heroic or catastrophically stupid, just Silverleaf and Stormroot from the guards' storage rooms, stuffed into her coat before anyone noticed a wild pack girl had ever been there at all. She had a dying brother waiting at home. That was the only thing that mattered. Finn had been burning with fever for 5 days. The village healer had stopped coming on the 4th. Royal apothecaries didn't treat Omega children from border settlements, everyone knew that. The kingdom's mercy ended at the city walls, and everything beyond that boundary was left to survive however it could. Julia had tried every remedy she knew, had bartered her last good knife for foreign herbs that did nothing, had sat beside her brother's cot through 3 sleepless nights watching his breathing grow shallow and telling herself it would turn. It hadn't turned, so she had done the only thing left. She stole. The cliffside fortress sat 3 miles east of her village, carved into black rock at the edge of the kingdom's wildlands. The place where wolves who broke royal law were sent to be forgotten. Julia had scouted it for 2 days. She knew the patrol rotation, the blind spots, the eastern storage corridor the guards used for confiscated goods. She knew which window had a broken latch. She knew how to move through darkness without making sound, because growing up in a forest pack meant learning early that the quiet ones survived. She had almost made it out. The Silverleaf was already in her coat. Her hands had closed around the Stormroot. 30 more seconds and she would have been gone, just another shadow dissolving back into the tree line. Then the first explosion hit. The floor lurched. Stone dust rained from the ceiling. Somewhere deep beneath her feet, something structural gave way with a sound like a mountain cracking, and fire, orange and enormous and moving fast, burst upward through the ventilation grates in the corridor floor. Screaming erupted from the cell blocks below. Run! Julia was already moving. Every instinct she had pointed toward the exit, toward the broken window, the tree line, the darkness that would swallow her whole and ask no questions. She was nobody. She was a thief with stolen herbs and a sick brother, and absolutely no business being inside a burning royal prison. She ran. She made it as far as the junction before she heard the chains. She stopped. Later, she would not be able to explain why. It wasn't a sound she recognized. Not prisoner shackles. Not the thin rattle of iron cuffs. This was something heavier, slower, a deep, resonant clanking from the far end of the corridor, past the point where the torchlight failed and smoke had already begun pooling black against the floor. The kind of sound that didn't belong to something restrained. It belonged to something buried. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and like button and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I love to know where this story found you. Now let's dive in. Julia turned. The cell was set apart from the others, separated by a stretch of empty corridor, as though whatever lived inside it required distance from ordinary things. The bars were wrong, too thick, too deliberate, and the lock was unlike anything she'd seen on the other doors, not a standard prison mechanism, but something layered, something etched, the iron itself carved with runes that pulsed a sick and steady amber in the firelight. Inside the cell, a man sat on the stone floor. The image hit her before her mind could process it properly. He was massive, broad-shouldered and bare-chested, scarred in the particular way of someone who had survived things that should have killed them, and built with the kind of scale that made the cell feel undersized around him. Even sitting, even chained, even with blood running dark from a cut across his brow and ash-grey against his skin, even then, he looked less like a prisoner and more like a king someone had forced onto his knees. The chains on his wrists and ankles glowed, the same amber as the runes, the same sick, steady pulse like a heartbeat that wasn't his, draining something from him with every slow throb. He didn't look up when Julia stopped in the doorway. "Leave," he said. His voice was low and rough, and stripped to almost nothing, but it carried the way thunder carried, not loud, just inevitable. While you still can. Julia's wolf went completely still inside her. She should have listened. She read the chains instead. She had grown up in forest pack territory, raised at the edge of wild magic, learning to read curse work the way other children learned their letters. She knew drain bindings. She knew what they did over time, the slow leaching of power, week by week, year by year, until nothing remained of what the man had been, until he was empty enough to stop being dangerous. Whoever had put him here hadn't wanted him punished. They had wanted him erased. "Those runes," she said, "they're not holding you. They're hollowing you out. For the first time, he looked up. Dark eyes found hers through the smoke. Something passed between them, wordless, inexplicable. The specific silence of two people standing at the edge of something neither of them chose. Yes, he said quietly. The ceiling groaned above them. Somewhere close, a beam gave way. Julia picked up the fallen guard's sword from the floor. "What are you doing?" His voice sharpened. "Saving you," she said, and drove the blade into the lock. It took 3 strikes. The runes cracked on the second, shattered on the third, and the moment the iron broke, the air broke with it. Power detonated through the cell like a storm finding open sky. It hit Julia in the chest and knocked her back a full step, and her wolf, who had been so carefully still, went electric. The chains snapped, not from her sword, from him. He rose slowly, and the room rose with him somehow. The air thickening, the pressure of his presence filling every corner of the burning corridor as he straightened to his full height. His eyes had stopped being dark. They glowed gold, faint and fierce, the way a banked fire glows when something feeds it suddenly. He stared at his freed wrists like a man who had forgotten what his own hands looked like. "You broke them," he said. Julia took a breath. "Who are you?" The ceiling collapsed. There was no more time for answers. His hand closed around her arm, firm, urgent, certain, and they ran together through the fire and the falling stone and the screaming dark. Toward the one exit Julia had spent 2 careful days memorizing. They burst through the hidden passage and hit cold night air like surfacing from deep water. Both of them collapsed on the rocky ground outside the fortress walls. The prison burned behind them, orange light against black cliffs, enormous and indifferent. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then he turned to her, ash on his face, blood at his temple, eyes still faintly gold in the dark. "Why?" he asked. Julia wiped soot from her cheek. "I couldn't leave someone to burn." He studied her with an expression she couldn't read. Then, slowly, he said the name, Darlington. The word landed like a stone dropped into still water, and every ripple it made was cold. Julia knew that name. Every wolf in the kingdom knew that name. The Alpha King who had vanished 3 years ago during the border wars. The king, the council said, had died in battle. The king whose absence had left the kingdom in the hands of his advisors, and whose absence had meant, among other things, that soldiers burned grain stores in villages that couldn't pay their taxes, and healers stopped treating Omega children, and girls like Julia had to become thieves just to keep their brothers alive. She stared at him. He looked back. Distant horns sounded from the burning fortress. "Go," he said. Julia ran. She didn't look back until the tree line swallowed her, and by then, the rocky ground where he had stood was empty. But in the shadows at the fortress wall, invisible to everything except the night and the fire and the scent on the wind, Darlington stood watching the forest where she had disappeared. 3 years the curse had been draining him. 3 years he had sat in that cell while traitors wore his crown. Now, the chains were broken. Because of one wild pack girl who had come to steal medicine and stayed to save a stranger. He looked down at the shattered iron still hanging from his wrists, dropped it into the fire. His wolf silent for 3 years, buried under cursed iron, and stolen time stirred awake, and one scent rose above the smoke. "Mate." Darlington turned toward the forest, and began to follow her home. He did not follow her immediately. That surprised him, honestly. His wolf was already straining toward the tree line, already fixed on the scent trail she had left through the cold air, pine resin and wood smoke, and something underneath that his wolf kept circling back to, insistent and low, like a song played in a register only he could hear. But Darlington had learned, in 3 years of chains, how to make himself wait. He stood at the edge of the burning fortress and breathed instead. Just breathed. It was a simple thing, an ordinary thing. He had done it 10,000 times without thinking. But for 3 years, every breath had come through iron and cursed air, and the slow, grinding sensation of something being taken from him quietly, consistently, the way a river takes a cliff face, not all at once, but grain by grain, until one day you look, and the stone is gone. Now the air just tasted like night. Cold, clean, his. He flexed his hands slowly and felt the power move through him, cautious at first, like something testing whether the cage was truly gone, and then stronger, flooding back through muscle and bone with the particular violence of a river finding a broken dam. He felt it reach his wolf, and his wolf surged. 3 years of forced silence erupting into something enormous and awake and furious. Darlington dropped to one knee, not from weakness, from the shock of feeling like himself again. He pressed one fist into the rocky ground and let the wave pass through him, and while it did, the memories came with it, the ones the curse had kept conveniently blurred, softened at the edges, stripped of urgency. They sharpened now with brutal clarity. The War Council. 12 men seated around the obsidian table in the Eastern War Chamber. Faces he had trusted. Faces he had fought beside. Varric at the head, always composed. Always the voice of careful reason, while Darlington was the sword. His war advisor. The man who had managed the kingdom's politics while Darlington managed its enemies. The man who had smiled across that table while the rune-marked wine was poured. Darlington had known something was wrong the moment it touched his throat, had stood too fast, knocked the chair back, reached for the power in his wolf, and found it already going, already muffled, already wrapped in something that didn't belong to him. He had been unconscious before he hit the floor. He'd woken in the cell 3 years ago. Darlington rose slowly to his full height and stared at the burning prison. The fire was spreading to the upper towers now, the flames orange and hungry against the black cliffs. Somewhere inside, guards were shouting. Somewhere further, horns were sounding toward the capital news traveling fast, the way bad news always did. The Alpha King is dead, they had announced. Fallen in battle. The kingdom mourns. The kingdom mourned. And while it mourned, the council governed. While it mourned, Varric ruled. And while it mourned, Wildpack villages burned for unpaid taxes. Omega children went without healers. And a girl with red hair and a stolen coat had been driven to breaking into a royal prison just to keep her brother alive. Something cold settled in Darlington's chest. He turned away from the fire and followed her home. Julia ran until her lungs gave out, then walked until the familiar smell of cookfire ash and river clay told her she was close. The village appeared through the trees the way it always did, small and dark and stubbornly alive. The handful of timber houses clustered around the central well like they were holding each other upright. She went straight to Finn. He was exactly where she'd left him in the cot by the window, the blanket pulled to his chin, his breathing audible from the doorway. Too fast, too shallow. His face in the grey pre-dawn light was the colour of old paper, and when Julia pressed the back of her hand to his forehead, the heat nearly made her flinch. "I've got you," she said quietly. To him, or to herself, she wasn't entirely sure. She worked by candlelight, hands steady with the focus of someone who had been forcing steadiness for days. Silver leaf steeped in boiled water for the fever. Stormroot crushed and mixed with rendered fat and pressed against his chest for the infection in his lungs. Old remedies, forest pack remedies, the kind noble healers dismissed and wild wolves had survived on for centuries. By the time pale grey light began pressing at the window, Finn's breathing had deepened. Not well, not yet, but easier. The terrible speed of it had slowed, and when Julia finally allowed herself to sit back against the wall and close her eyes, she felt something loosen in her chest that had been locked tight for 5 days. She should have slept. She couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the cell, the glowing runes, the chains, the way he had risen when they broke that awful, magnificent surge of presence, like watching something tidal reclaim its shore. She felt again the moment his hand had closed around her arm, certain and unhesitating, the grip of someone who had not forgotten what it meant to protect. Darlington. The name came back to her in the dark and sat heavily. She turned it over the way you turned over something that might be a stone and might be a blade, carefully, at a distance, not yet sure which. Alpha King Darlington was alive, which meant the council had lied, which meant everything the kingdom had done in his name for 3 years, every order, every punishment, every village left to starve, had been done by someone else, which also meant that Julia had broken a royal prisoner free from a royal fortress. She pressed her palms flat against the floor. In this kingdom, that was an execution. It didn't matter that the prisoner had been the rightful king. It didn't matter that the chains had been draining him, that someone had put him there to destroy him quietly, that Julia had acted on instinct and desperation, and the very specific cruelty of a choice made in seconds inside a burning building. The law did not care about context. The law cared about the act. She broke royal chains. The council would not see a girl who saved a king. They would see a wild pack Omega who interfered with a royal sentence. They would make an example of her in the way powerful, frightened people always made examples loudly, publicly, and without mercy. Julia stared at the ceiling. Finn stirred in the cot beside her, and she reached out instinctively, resting one hand against his arm. "It's okay," she murmured. "Go back to sleep." He settled. She didn't. Outside the window, the forest was silent, too silent. Some part of her noted the birds had stopped, the way they stopped when something larger than them moved through the undergrowth, something that made smaller creatures go very, very still. Julia's wolf came alert in her chest. She stood slowly, moved to the window, looked out into the pale morning light where the tree line met the edge of the village, the rough boundary between the settled world and the wild one, the place where the forest simply stopped and the houses began. At the edge of that boundary, half hidden in shadow, a figure stood, still, watching, too large to be anyone from the village, too steady to be anything afraid. The morning light caught his eyes. Gold. Julia's breath stopped. He had found her already. He didn't knock. He simply appeared in her doorway the way weather appeared, without announcement, without apology, filling the frame completely and making the small cabin feel suddenly, acutely smaller. Julia had the knife at his throat before the door finished swinging open. Her hand was steady. Her wolf was not. Darlington looked down at the blade without moving, without flinching, with the particular stillness of something that had long ago stopped being frightened of sharp things. "You followed me," Julia said. "Yes." "That's not something I gave you permission to do." The faintest shift moved through his expression, not quite amusement, not quite apology, something in between that made her grip tighten. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She held the knife exactly where it was. He let her. That was the thing that threw her, that he simply let her. No grab for the blade, no step backward, no assertion of the kind of authority that a man his size, with his obvious power, could have deployed without effort. He just stood in her doorway with a knife at his throat and waited for her to decide what happened next, as though the decision genuinely belonged to her. Julia lowered the blade slowly. She didn't put it away. "Come inside," she said. "Before someone sees you." He had been in the forest for 2 days. She could see it in him, the travel worn into his posture, the dried mud on his boots, the way he moved through her small space with the careful deliberateness of someone managing more exhaustion than they intended to show. He had eaten nothing, she suspected, slept less. His wolf had not let him stop. Julia understood that in a way she wished she didn't. She had felt it too, that low, persistent pull in her chest for 2 days, the direction of it always the same, always pointing somewhere just beyond the tree line. She had told herself it was nerves, paranoia, the reasonable fear of a woman who had freed a royal prisoner and was waiting for the consequences to arrive. She had not let herself name it anything else. She set water to boil and kept her back to him and said, "You should have gone to the capital, reclaimed your throne, done whatever it is kings do when they return from the dead." "I will," Darlington said. "There are things I need to understand first." "You don't need me for that." A pause. "No," he said quietly. "But I needed to see you were safe." Julia turned around. He was looking at her with an expression she didn't know what to do with, direct and serious and stripped of pretense, the way someone looked when they had decided to stop performing and simply be honest. It was more unsettling than the golden eyes, more unsettling than the size of him, or the power she could feel radiating off him even now, even restrained, even careful. "I'm not your responsibility," she said. "You freed me. That was a mistake made under time pressure." Something flickered in his expression. Was it? Julia looked away first. "You should know," she said, "that what I did breaking you out the council will call that a crime. A wild pack Omega interfering with a royal sentence. They'll execute me for it if they find out." "They won't," he said. The certainty in his voice was absolute, immediate, the kind that didn't leave room for argument. "I won't allow it. You were chained in a cell 3 days ago. With respect, your permission and 5 coppers won't stop a council execution order. I wasn't the Alpha King 3 days ago," he said. "I am now." The water began to boil. Julia turned to deal with it, needing the motion, needing something to do with her hands. She pressed a cup into his grip without asking whether he wanted it, and he accepted it the same way without discussion, as though the exchange was already familiar somehow. She hated that it felt familiar. She sat across from him and made herself focus. "Tell me what happened to you," she said. "The truth. All of it." He told her. She had suspected parts of it, the betrayal, the cursed chains, the deliberate imprisonment, but hearing it plainly, in his measured voice with no performance around it, made it land differently, made it real in a way it hadn't been in the burning cell, when survival had crowded out everything else. When he finished, she sat with it quietly for a moment. Then she said, "The soldiers who burned our grain stores 18 months ago, they came with royal orders, the council's seal. Darlington went very still. They said the Alpha King had authorized new taxation enforcement, that border settlements were hoarding resources that belonged to the crown." Julia kept her voice flat. She had learned to keep her voice flat when she talked about it. 3 families had nothing left to eat that winter. 1 child died. The silence in the cabin changed texture. "I never gave that order," Darlington said. "I know that now. Julia, there are 6 other villages within a day's ride of here," she said. "All of them have the same story. Royal soldiers, royal seals, grain burned or taken, wolves beaten for refusing." She met his eyes. "Someone has been signing your name for 3 years." She watched it move through him, the realization assembling itself behind those gold eyes like storm clouds building on a clear horizon. Not surprise, exactly. Confirmation of a shape he had already been afraid to look at directly. His jaw tightened. "Varric," he said. "Not a question." Julia watched the Alpha King sit in her small cabin, with a cracked cup in his hands, and his kingdom in ruins around him, and understand fully, finally, the scale of what had been done in his absence, and what he would have to do next. Julia told herself she was only going because she knew the roads. That was the practical reason, the sensible reason. Darlington didn't know these territories, not the way they were now, not after 3 years of Varric's reshaping. The paths had changed. The checkpoints had multiplied. There were new watchtowers on the eastern roads, and the guards at the border crossings no longer wore the old kingdom crest. They wore something slightly different, a modification so subtle that most people hadn't noticed. Julia had noticed. She noticed everything that had quietly, incrementally, gotten worse. So she went. Not for him. For the villages. She told herself that firmly on the first morning, as she handed Darlington a plain wool coat from her storage chest, the kind a traveling merchant's assistant might wear, and watched him pull it on over those broad shoulders with the expression of a man who had never in his life dressed to disappear. "You need to look smaller," she said. He looked at her. "Less like yourself," she clarified. "And what do I look like?" "Like someone people instinctively step back from." She adjusted the collar briskly, not meeting his eyes. "We're trying to avoid that." He was quiet for a moment. Then, with complete seriousness, "Should I hunch?" Julia almost smiled. She didn't. "Just don't speak unless I tell you to," she said, and walked out the door. They started with the villages closest to the fortress road. Calderwick first, or what remained of it. The settlement had once been mid-sized by Wild Pack standards, known for its river trade and its healers. Now it was a scatter of emptied buildings and fire-blackened foundations. The remaining families clustered in 4 houses at the far edge of what had been the market square. An old woman named Sessa told them the rest without being asked. The way people told stories they had been carrying too long. Royal soldiers had come 14 months ago, with a taxation order bearing the Alpha King's seal. The village had paid what it could. It hadn't been enough. The soldiers had taken the river trade stockpile, 3 fishing boats, and the healer's entire store of medicines. When the village elder protested, they burned his house as a demonstration of royal authority. "The king's orders," Sessa said, with a flatness that was worse than anger. "That's what they told us, the king's orders." Beside Julia, she felt Darlington go absolutely still. He said nothing. He had kept his word, hadn't spoken once, had let Julia ask the questions, had stood slightly behind her in the worn merchant's coat, looking at the ground. But Julia could feel the quality of his silence changing with every word the old woman spoke. Something was building in him, controlled and cold and deep, the way pressure built in rock before it fractured. They left coin on the doorstep when they went. Darlington's coin. He had produced it without explanation, and Julia hadn't asked. Calderwick was not the exception. Over 4 days, they moved through 6 settlements. 2 had been burned for tax refusal. 1 had been forcibly relocated to make room for a new noble hunting estate. 1 had lost its pack alpha to a royal arrest on charges Julia had never heard invoked before: obstruction of Crown resource allocation, a charge so invented it didn't even have a proper legal framework, just a freshly stamped seal and soldiers with swords. In every village, the same words: the Alpha King's orders. In every village, the same look when those words were spoken, not fury, not grief, but something worse. The look of people who had accepted, fully and finally, that the Crown had simply decided they did not matter. He knew which villages to target, Darlington said on the 4th evening, when they had stopped at a wayfarer's shelter 2 miles from the road. His voice was quiet, controlled, the way a blade was controlled. The border settlements, the forest packs, the river traders, the communities with no political representation in the capital, no one to bring complaints before the council, no one to ask questions in rooms where questions get heard. Varric managed your political relationships for 6 years, Julia said. He knew exactly which people no one would listen to. Darlington looked at the fire. He didn't just imprison me, he said. He wore me, used my name, my seal, my authority, and made sure every act of cruelty was attached to it, so that when I returned, the kingdom would already hate you, Julia finished. The fire crackled between them. She was watching him, without meaning to the way the firelight moved across his face, the particular weight of what he was carrying visible for just a moment before he locked it back down. It was the face of a man recalibrating the full scope of a betrayal he had already known was bad. It was worse than he'd known. Her wolf stirred with an ache she didn't want to examine. She looked away. The mate bond had been pulling steadily for 4 days, a warmth in her chest that intensified when he was near and dulled to a persistent ache when he wasn't. She had been ignoring it with considerable discipline. She had reasons. Good ones. She had watched this kingdom's soldiers burn Calderwick's healers' stores, had watched what Crown authority did to people who trusted it. She was not built for trusting kings. She was still working out whether she was built for trusting this one. On the 5th morning, Julia woke to find Darlington already outside, standing at the shelter's edge looking east. Something in his posture had changed. "What is it?" she asked. "We were watched last night," he said. "Someone on the ridge. They moved when I came out." Julia's stomach dropped. "How long?" "Since Calderwick, I think." His eyes were gold in the early light. "Someone knows I'm alive." 300 miles away in the capital, in a tower office lined with maps and sealed documents and the quiet architecture of a stolen kingdom, a messenger arrived at Lord Varric's desk. He read the note once, then he read it again. His expression didn't change. That was the thing about Varric, it never did. He simply set the note down, smoothed it flat with 2 careful fingers, and looked out the window at the city below, the city that had been his for 3 years, the throne room he had been preparing to make official. He had always known this was possible. He had simply hoped the curse would finish what the chains had started. "Find her," he said to the shadow near the door. "The girl from the prison. Bring her to me." The stronghold didn't look like much from the outside. That was the point. It sat tucked into a granite hillside 3 miles north of the kingdom's main road, concealed behind a waterfall that had been rerouted generations ago by wolves who understood that the best protection wasn't walls, it was invisibility. From any angle on the approach path, it looked like rock face and moving water and the ordinary darkness of a forested hillside. You had to know the entrance existed to find it. Darlington knew. He had built it. Julia said nothing when they arrived, which he was learning meant she was paying close attention. She took in the hidden gate, the layered wolf guard posts, the way the wolves inside moved disciplined, quiet, unhurried, and he watched her recalibrate something privately, the way she always did, without showing the working. Finn said, "This is extraordinary." He had improved enough to say things like that. Still pale, still thin, still prone to coughing at the wrong moments, but the terrible speed of his breathing had gone, and his eyes were clear, And when Julia had helped him through the waterfall entrance and into the warm interior of the stronghold, he had looked around with genuine wonder instead of the blank exhaustion that had frightened her for days. That alone, Darlington thought, had been worth the detour. The stronghold's healer was a compact, sharp-eyed woman named Brecca, who had served Darlington's pack for 20 years and greeted his return with a single long look, a slow exhale, and the words, "You look terrible." "It's good to see you too," Darlington said. Brecca had Finn assessed, medicated, and installed in a proper sick room within the hour. She updated his treatment. The silverleaf had been correct. She told Julia with the tone of someone giving credit grudgingly, and added 3 other compounds that would do what the forest remedies couldn't. She said he would need 2 weeks of rest minimum. Finn, from his cot, "I feel fine." Brecca, without looking up from her notes, "You feel better than dying. That's not the same as fine." Julia had laughed, a short, unguarded sound that she seemed surprised by herself. Darlington filed it away. He watched her in those first days at the stronghold. Not the way he had watched her on the road, with the constant low vigilance of someone managing threats from multiple directions. More quietly than that. More honestly. She was careful with people attentive in the way of someone who had learned early that nobody else was going to be attentive, so she had better be. She learned the names of every wolf in the stronghold within the first day. She helped in the supply rooms without being asked. When 2 of his younger scouts had a disagreement that was escalating badly, she talked them down with a practicality so direct it bypassed their pride entirely, and they separated looking vaguely puzzled about why they were no longer angry. She had no idea, he suspected, how rare that was. On the 3rd evening, he found her sitting outside Finn's room with her back against the wall and her eyes closed, not sleeping, just still for the first time in what he suspected was weeks. She looked like someone setting down something very heavy for 5 minutes before picking it back up. Darlington sat down beside her. Not close, just near. She didn't open her eyes. "You don't have to check on me." "I know," he said. They sat in the quiet for a while. "He's going to be all right," Darlington said. "Brecca doesn't miss." A pause. Then, "I know." Her voice was different when she talked about Finn, less guarded, more exposed, like a seam in armor. "He's all I have left. Our parents died when he was 4. I've been keeping him alive so long it's become the thing I do. I don't know what I'll do when he doesn't need keeping alive anymore." "Maybe," Darlington said carefully, "you could try something for yourself." She opened her eyes and looked at him sideways. "Is that what kings do?" she asked. "Dispense life advice in corridors. Only the good ones." She almost smiled. Modest, too. The bond between them had settled into something steadier over the last few days, less like a current trying to knock her over, and more like a warmth she was gradually, reluctantly, stopping fighting against. He could feel it from his side too, the way his wolf oriented toward her without instruction, the way the stronghold felt more like a place worth defending now that she was in it. He didn't press it. He understood, at a bone-deep level, that trust with Julia would not be commanded or rushed or won through charm. It would be built, if it was built, through honesty and time and the accumulation of small actions that meant what they claimed to mean. He had time. What he didn't have was the luxury of the council's ignorance. The rumors reached them on the 6th day. One of his scouts returned from a capital run with news that landed like cold water. The Royal Council had issued a formal statement. The Alpha King was confirmed dead, a lie they had apparently decided to double down on rather than scramble to explain. And an imposter, the statement claimed, was moving through the border territories spreading dangerous falsehoods and destabilizing wildpack settlements. A threat to kingdom security, to be reported immediately. Darlington read it twice. Then his scout placed a second document beside the first. Not an official council notice, something rougher. A bounty notice, circulating through the kingdom's mercenary networks. No name, just a description. A young woman, wild pack, red hair, last seen fleeing the cliffside prison fortress on the night of the fire. Wanted for questioning in connection with a royal security breach. Substantial reward for delivery. Alive. Darlington set the paper down very carefully. "How widely has this circulated?" he asked. "Widely enough," his scout said. "There were 3 hunting parties asking questions in the border settlements this morning." Julia appeared in the doorway a moment later, reading something in Darlington's posture before he had said a word. "What happened?" she asked. He turned to face her, and in his expression she found the answer before he gave it. They should have moved faster. That was the thought that sat in Julia's chest like a stone when they returned to find the village wrong too quiet. Smoke rising from the wrong direction, the particular stillness of a place where something bad had already finished happening. She was running before Darlington could say a word. The village looked like it had been turned over carefully. Not burned, Varric was too clever for the blunt statement of fire this time. Just disrupted, doors left open, the well rope cut. 3 families standing in the central clearing with the hollow expressions of people who had been thoroughly reminded of their own powerlessness. Old Cessa from 2 villages over was there. Inexplicably, she'd been trading, someone said. Just arrived. Just saw the end of it. How many soldiers? Darlington asked her quietly. 8. Royal crests. Came in fast. Knew exactly where to go. Cessa looked at Julia with something that was almost apology. They went straight to the healer's house. Julia was already moving. The sick room was empty. The blankets were still warm. She stood in the center of the small room for a long moment and did not make a sound. The medicine cups were still on the side table. Finn's worn boot, the left one. He always took his left boot off first, sat beside the cot like a period at the end of a sentence. They had taken him mid-rest. Sick, recovering, not yet strong. Her brother, 4 years old when their parents died. 14 now and still too young. Always too young. Always the one she was running toward or running for, or refusing to leave behind. She picked up the boot. Darlington appeared in the doorway. He didn't speak. He looked at the empty cot, and then at her face, and she watched something settle in him. Not the controlled cold she'd seen when he heard about the villages, but something older and quieter than that. Something that looked, she realized distantly, like genuine grief on her behalf. He crossed the room and placed something on the cot beside her. A folded piece of paper bearing a wax seal she recognized the royal crest, the one that had been on every taxation order, every enforcement notice, every document that had been making wild pack wolves miserable for 3 years. She didn't want to read it. She read it. The boy is well and will remain so. Return what was taken from the crown. Present yourself before the council and relinquish your false claim, or the kingdom will learn what becomes of those who shelter traitors. You have 3 days. The throne belongs to its rightful steward now. ESP. Julia set the paper down. He's not asking you to surrender, she said. Her voice came out steady. She was faintly surprised. He's announcing himself. Rightful steward. He's already decided he's taking the throne publicly. Yes. Darlington's voice was very quiet. He used Finn to get you to move, to force you into the open before you're ready. She looked up. If you walk into that council chamber on his terms, I know he'll have you killed, or rechained, or both, in whichever order is most useful to him politically. I know that too. Julia stared at him. Then what are you going to do? Darlington looked at the paper for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that she had not seen there before, not fury exactly, though fury was part of it, more like resolution, the look of a man who had been patient for a very long time, through circumstances that would have broken patience in anyone else, and had now reached the end of it. Varric wants me to walk into his trap quietly, he said. Alone, discredited, a rumor made flesh, easily dismissed. He folded the paper once and set it aside. So I won't do that. What's the alternative? I walk in publicly. He met her eyes. In front of everyone. Wolves, nobles, council, common people. I walk in as what I am, with evidence of what was done to me. And I let the kingdom decide who is standing in front of them. Julia understood immediately. He's been telling everyone, you're an imposter. If you appear in public, he'll have to prove I'm not the king, Darlington said. In front of the very people he's been ruling in my name. Every wolf who followed my orders without question for 3 years will have to look at me and decide. A pause. I spent 3 years in chains, because Varric worked in shadows, and I didn't see it coming. I won't let him pull me back into the dark. The room was quiet. Finn's boot was still in Julia's hands. She set it down carefully beside the empty cot, as though he would need it when he came back. as though that was simply a fact about the future she was deciding to hold on to. "I'm coming with you," she said. "Julia, I have the chains." She looked up. The broken, cursed shackles from the prison. Physical evidence of your imprisonment, bearing Varric's rune marks. "Without them, you're a man making a claim. With them, Darlington said slowly, "I'm a king showing his wounds." She held his gaze. "Get your people ready," she said. "We move tomorrow." The Royal Council gathered once a month in the capital's Great Hall. Darlington had chosen the date deliberately. He knew the schedule had set it himself, 6 years ago, when he decided that governance worked better with visible structure than invisible authority. Open sessions. Nobles, pack representatives, merchants, common wolves, all permitted to observe from the gallery above, while the council conducted official business below. Varric had kept the schedule. Of course he had. It was harder to question a man who maintained appearances. They entered through the main gate, not the servant entrance, not the hidden passage beneath the eastern wall that Darlington had used a dozen times for sensitive arrivals. The main gate wide open for council day, flanked by ceremonial guards who were supposed to be symbolic and were currently staring at the group approaching across the courtyard with expressions of escalating alarm. Darlington walked at the front. He had abandoned the merchant's coat. He wore what he was, no crown, no ceremony, just the plain authority of a man who had stopped pretending to be anything other than what he was. The stronghold wolves walked behind him, a dozen of them, loyal pack members who had spent 3 years keeping his name alive in whispers. They walked without weapons drawn. They didn't need weapons drawn. The guards at the door looked at Darlington's face and stepped aside, not because they were ordered to, because something older than orders told them to. He pushed through the hall doors. The council session stopped. 40 faces turned. Nobles in formal dress, pack representatives from across the kingdom, the council's 7 seated members, and at the head of the long obsidian table, Lord Varric, in a chair that was not quite the throne, but was positioned with careful, unmistakable intention to suggest one. Varric's expression didn't change. That was the first thing Darlington noted. Not surprise, not fear. The faint, composed adjustment of a man shifting from one prepared scenario to another. He had planned for this. Of course he had. "Remarkable," Varric said into the silence, his voice carrying easily through the hall's stone acoustics. "The imposter arrives in person." He looked out at the assembled gallery with the patient authority of someone who had been practicing that authority for years. "As the council has been warned, a cursed wolf, driven mad by dark magic, claiming a dead king's identity." The murmur that moved through the hall was divided. Julia had warned him it would be. 3 years was a long time. Half the people in this room had never personally seen Darlington's face. The other half had been told, consistently and officially, that the man they remembered was dead. Darlington let the murmur settle. Then he spoke. He didn't shout. He didn't perform. He simply used the voice he had always used in this room, the one that assumed, without aggression, that it would be heard. "My name is Darlington, Alpha King of this kingdom, son of Aldrich, who rebuilt the Eastern Territories after the border collapse. I sat at this table for 6 years before I was drugged by my war advisor, bound in cursed runes, and imprisoned in the cliffside fortress where I was left to be slowly destroyed." He looked around the room. "I have been in that cell for 3 years. The orders issued in my name during that time, the taxation enforcement, the village destructions, the pack relocations I did not give them. They were forged by the man currently sitting at the head of my table." Varric smiled. "An elaborate fiction. Tell me something," Darlington said. "Where was I when the grain stores in Calderwick burned? Where was I when the Thornfield pack was displaced to make room for Lord Harwick's hunting estate? Where was I when a child died of starvation in a border settlement that had its food supply confiscated? He let that land, because I was in a cell, bound in chains that I will show this council the moment my witness arrives. Chains anyone could fabricate. Chains bearing your rune marks, Varric." The hall went very quiet. For the first time, something shifted in Varric's composure, just slightly, just enough. The doors opened. Julia walked in. She moved through the hall without looking at the gallery, without looking at Varric, without performing anything. She carried the broken shackles in both hands, the shattered iron, the cracked rune cuffs, the evidence of 3 years of deliberate, magical imprisonment, and she set them on the council table with a sound that rang through the stone room like a struck bell. "I pulled these off him myself," she said. "In a burning prison 3 weeks ago. The rune work is documented. Any curse reader in this kingdom can confirm the mark." The hall erupted. Darlington watched the crowd, the faces turning, the calculations happening, the slow, irreversible momentum of a truth that had finally become too large to manage. Nobles who had followed Varric's orders without question were now looking at him with new arithmetic in their eyes. Pack representatives, who had spent 3 years absorbing the consequences of forged royal orders, were looking at the chains on the table. Varric stood. "Touching," he said, over the noise, loud enough to cut through it. The composure was back locked into place, perfectly fitted, not a crack showing. A cursed wolf and a wild pack thief with a piece of theatre. He looked directly at Julia, though I do wonder if she'll be quite as brave when she hears about her brother. The hall went still again. Julia's face didn't change, but Darlington saw her hands close at her sides. "The boy is comfortable," Varric said pleasantly. "For now. Whether he remains so depends entirely on how the next few hours unfold." He spread his hands, a gesture of perfect, monstrous reasonableness. "I suggest we all calm down and discuss this like civilized wolves." They met at the prison because Varric chose it. That told Darlington everything he needed to know about the man's psychology, the theatrical impulse underneath all that composure, the need to stage things properly. Varric had always understood power as performance. He had chosen the cliffside fortress because it was symbolic, because it was where he had won 3 years ago, and he wanted that geography around him again. Darlington obliged him. He came alone, as the message specified, or appeared to. Julia had not argued about the plan, which meant she had already decided what she was going to do, and saw no reason to discuss it. He had learned, in the weeks since the burning prison, that this was simply how she operated. She listened, assessed, and then acted on her own conclusions with a directness that bypassed negotiation entirely. He had stopped finding it frustrating approximately 4 days after meeting her. The prison was a ruin now. The fire had taken the upper towers completely, leaving blackened skeleton walls open to the sky, stone corridors exposed to wind and the smell of old smoke. The guards were gone. The cells stood empty, doors hanging open, the whole structure hollowed out and silent in the way of places that had held suffering and now held only the memory of it. Varric was waiting in the central courtyard. Finn was beside him standing, which meant they had kept him well enough to be useful as leverage. His face was pale and tightly controlled, the expression of someone working very hard not to show fear. He looked at Darlington once with wide eyes, and then fixed his gaze on the middle distance. "Smart boy." "You came," Varric said. "You have something of mine," Darlington said. Varric smiled. "Several things. Arguably." He looked well. That was the infuriating part. 3 years of stolen authority sitting easily on him, not a trace of guilt in his bearing. The same careful composure he had worn at the War Council table when he had smiled across at Darlington and poured the drugged wine. "Tell me something," Darlington said. "Was it always the plan? Or did you decide partway through that I was more useful imprisoned than dead?" "Dead men become martyrs," Varric said simply. "Imprisoned men become rumors. Much easier to manage." He tilted his head. "Besides, I needed the time. The kingdom doesn't transfer loyalty overnight. It took 2 years before they stopped asking questions about you and started simply accepting the answers I gave them. And the curse." A pause. Something almost genuine moved through Varric's expression. "You were becoming something I couldn't predict," he said. "Your wolf, the power in it was growing beyond anything your father had. Beyond anything the old bloodline records documented. In another 5 years, you would have been something the council couldn't balance against, couldn't advise, couldn't manage." The word carried the weight of what Varric truly valued. The curse was meant to be permanent, a slow dissolution. You would have simply diminished until there was nothing left to come back from. "But I broke the chains," Darlington said. "A girl broke your chains," Varric corrected. a nobody wildpack girl who came to steal medicine and made the most consequential mistake of her life. From somewhere in the ruined upper structure, a stone shifted. Varric heard it too. His eyes moved upward just for a second, and Darlington moved. The fight was not elegant. That was the truth of it, the thing the stories would later smooth over. It was brutal and close, and Varric was not the soft political creature he appeared. He had been a war advisor because he understood war, had trained alongside soldiers for decades, and had spent 3 years in unchallenged authority that had made him bold. He had also, Darlington discovered, prepared something else. The second rune hit him from behind a cursed strike from a device Varric had embedded in the courtyard stone, triggered at a distance. It wasn't the full imprisonment chain, but it was enough. Darlington felt it slam into his wolf like a door swinging shut. The power suddenly muffled, the connection dimmed. He went to one knee. Varric crossed the courtyard toward him. The curse left residue, Varric said. 3 years of rune work doesn't simply vanish. You'll always be vulnerable to it. That's the elegant part. He crouched to Darlington's level, unhurried. You came back, which I respect. But this ends here, somewhere above them. Julia had found Finn. Darlington could hear it, footsteps. A door, his voice and hers, the particular quality of silence that meant the leverage was gone. Varric heard it too, watched his advantage evaporate in real time, and something finally cracked in that composed expression. He stood, reached for the second device. Darlington felt the rune work tightening, felt his wolf going under, and then a hand closed around his arm. Julia. She had come back. She pressed her palm flat against his chest, warm, certain, entirely present, and said, very quietly, I've got you. Come back. His wolf found her like a compass finding north. The rune work shattered. Power came back like a tide, and Darlington rose with it fully, completely, the 3 years of suppressed strength uncoiling all at once. He felt it reach every part of him that the curse had dimmed and flood back in, and his wolf surged awake with a force that shook the ruined courtyard walls. Varric ran. He didn't get far. When it was over, Darlington stood in the courtyard of the prison where he had spent 3 years in chains, with Varric restrained at his feet, and Julia beside him, and Finn, pale, tired, and deeply unimpressed by the entire experience, leaning against the ruined wall. Julia's hand was still in his. Neither of them had remarked on that yet. Peace, Julia discovered, was louder than war. War had a shape, a direction, a clear enemy, a moment when it ended. Peace was messier. Peace was 3 weeks of council sessions and territorial hearings and restoration orders and the slow, unglamorous work of undoing 3 years of deliberate damage. It was Darlington, at the obsidian table for 12 hours at a time, methodical and tireless, rebuilding what Varric had quietly dismantled. It was pack representatives arriving daily from settlements across the kingdom, each one carrying a specific grievance, a specific loss, a specific accounting of what had been taken and what might be returned. It was loud and complicated and necessary. Julia watched most of it from a distance. She had a talent for useful invisibility, for being present enough to help, and unobtrusive enough not to require managing. She sat in the back of sessions and took notes nobody asked her to take. She cross-referenced village testimony against the forged order records that Darlington's wolves had pulled from Varric's files. She found 3 settlement relocations that hadn't made it onto the official restitution list and added them quietly. Nobody had given her a title or a role. She had simply identified what needed doing and done it. Finn recovered fully by the 2nd week. Brecca declared him fit with the same grudging precision she applied to everything, and he celebrated by eating an alarming quantity of food and attaching himself to the Stronghold's youngest scouts with an enthusiasm that suggested he had been waiting his entire life for exactly this kind of access. He was fine. He was better than fine. Julia had no more reason to stay. She knew it. Had been knowing it. Quietly. For days, the way you knew something you were not quite ready to act on. The capital wasn't her world. The council chambers and formal halls and careful political architectures of a kingdom reordering itself. None of it was built for a wildpack girl from a border settlement who had come to steal medicine and ended up accidentally altering the course of history. She packed her things on a Tuesday morning. She was very nearly done when Darlington appeared in the doorway. She didn't look up. Don't. You weren't going to say goodbye. I was going to leave a note. Julia. She set down the coat she was folding and looked at him. He was in formal dress council clothes, the kind he wore for official sessions, which meant he had come here directly from something important. His expression was the one she had learned to read as him deciding to say the honest thing rather than the manageable thing. She braced. "Come to the council chamber," he said. "Darlington. Please." She had never heard him use that word before. She went. The full council was assembled. Every seat filled nobles, pack representatives, the restored territorial leaders whose positions Varric had eliminated. 40 faces turning as she walked in, and Julia kept her chin level and her pace steady and reminded herself that she had faced worse than a room full of people looking at her. Darlington stood at the head of the table. He waited until she had stopped at the room's center before he spoke. 3 weeks ago, he said, addressing the chamber, this council was presented with evidence of the longest and most calculated betrayal in this kingdom's recorded history. You have seen the chains. You have seen the rune documentation. You have heard the village testimonies. A pause. What you have not formally heard is the name of the person without whom none of that evidence would exist, without whom your king would have died in a prison cell while a traitor wore his crown. He looked at Julia. Her name is Julia. She is a wild pack Omega from the border settlements. She came to the cliffside fortress to steal medicine for her dying brother, and instead she broke a cursed king's chains with a fallen guard's sword and 3 strikes of pure, reckless courage. The chamber was very quiet. She is not a criminal, Darlington continued. She is not a security breach or a witness or a person of interest. She is the reason this kingdom has a king. Another pause. Longer this time. She is also my mate, recognized by my wolf on the night she freed me. And I am formally declaring that recognition before this council now not as a political arrangement, not as a reward, but as the truth of what she is to me. Julia's heart was doing something loud and inconvenient. I'm not asking the council's permission, he said. I'm informing you of a fact. What I am asking, and here he looked directly at her, only at her, the chamber and the 40 faces and the weight of the kingdom falling away until it was just this, is her. The silence stretched. Julia thought about her village, her small cabin, the life she knew how to live small and hard and entirely her own. She thought about the coat she had handed him in the dark, the knife at his throat, the 4 days on the road watching him absorb the damage done in his name without flinching, his hand closing around hers in the ruined courtyard, or hers around his, she was no longer sure who had reached first. She thought about Finn, who was currently somewhere in the stronghold making friends and eating too much and becoming the person he'd always been meant to be. She thought about the girl who had gone to steal medicine, who she was now. She walked to the head of the table, stood beside him. I have conditions, she said. Something lit in his eyes. The border settlements get full restitution, healers in every wild pack territory within the year, and nobody calls me Luna until I've decided I'm comfortable with it. A beat. Agreed, Darlington said. All of it. Julia looked out at the council, at the kingdom reassembling itself around them, loud and messy and alive. Then we have work to do, she said. They stood on the eastern rampart that evening, as the sun dropped behind the territories, the forests and settlements and river roads of a kingdom that had almost been lost, spread out below them in the fading gold light. Darlington's hand was in hers. Neither of them had remarked on it yet. She thought they probably didn't need to. You know, Julia said. I only went to that prison for Silverleaf. I know. I had a very simple plan. I know that too. She looked out at the kingdom. At all of it, the impossible, inconvenient, thoroughly unplanned shape of where she had ended up. The night I freed you, she said quietly, I thought I'd made the worst mistake of my life. Darlington was quiet for a moment. And now? Julia looked at him sideways. And this time, finally, she let herself smile. Ask me again, in a year, she said. His hand tightened around hers. Below them, the kingdom breathed, and the girl who had gone to steal medicine, who had broken a cursed king's chains with a borrowed sword and 3 desperate strikes, stood beside the throne she had never asked for, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like exactly where she was supposed to be. If you enjoyed the story, let me know in the comments. Your voice decides what I write next. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more moonlit love stories like this one.